So in the previous lecture, we created an observable based on an interval, which fires every second. And this could be a valid use case. You might be building an application where something should happen every couple of seconds. For example, you might want to send an HTTP request and fetch data every X seconds. Or you might want to update some UI element for an animation or something like that every X seconds. In such scenarios, you could use this interval function to handle these use cases with an observable. You don't have to, of course. There always also are alternative ways of implementing such features, but you could. Now, this interval function here is of course not the only function you can use to create an observable. Instead, if you take a look at the official documentation, you'll find plenty of functions you can use when working with RxJS, though not all of these functions will create observables. Instead, indeed, most of these functions operate on existing observables and allow you to manipulate them or their values, to be precise. Because RxJS also has this concept of operators, which you can use when dealing with observables, which are in the end functions you can pipe into your observable data stream to perform transformations or any other kind of operation on those observable values. And I'll show you an example here for this interval observable. You can add operators to this observable pipeline by calling the pipe method before you subscribe. And indeed, you need at least one subscriber to kick off the observable. If you do not subscribe at least once, there will be no values being emitted here. That's just a side note. But with that, I'm calling pipe here before I'm subscribing, and pipe then allows you to add some operators, some RxJS operators to this pipeline. And you find these operator functions here in the official documentation as well. Of course, not just in the reference, but also if you go to the dedicated operators page where you can learn all about them. Though, as I mentioned before, it in the end depends on you, the team you work in, and your personal preferences, how deep you want to dive into RxJS. It's a feature you can use in your Angular apps, but not a feature you have to use too much. Nonetheless, here, to get started with operators, I'll add the map operator, which therefore must be imported from RxJS. So the map function is imported here. This function is then called here as an argument for this pipe function, and that then adds it as an operator to this pipeline. Now, if we take a look at the official reference and we search for this map function there, we can see that this is an operator which in the end converts a value that is emitted by an observable. So it in the end is a function that takes a function as an argument, and that function will then be executed on every value that's emitted by the observable, and it's then the function result that will be passed to the subscribers. So here we can pass a function to map, and we'll get the value that's emitted by this observable, on which we call map in the end. We'll get that as an input here, as a parameter. And we then must return the updated value. Now, since interval gives us a value of type number, we can, for example, multiply it with 2. And the subscriber will then get the result of this operator here. So the doubled number. And we could add multiple operators here if we wanted to perform multiple operations, not just map operations, but any kind of operations. Here, however, it is just map. With that, if we do that and reload, you'll see we still get some numbers being logged, but now we got double the number than before. So 2 instead of 1, 4 instead of 2, and so on, because we added this map operator here. And operators indeed are one of the key Rx features and also one important difference between observables and signals, though I'll get back to that in just a second. But operators are an important feature, and you'll see me use some operators at least from time to time throughout the rest of this course, though I'll then always explain why I'm using a certain operator and what it'll do. It's just important for now to be aware of the fact that with RxJS and these observables, you can add these operators that will then operate on the values that are emitted and managed by the observable. Okay, so we got started with setting up an observable with the interval function, and we added an operator. And this, as I mentioned, is a concept we'll see again a little bit later in the course when we work with some observables that are built into Angular. Now, you might recall that you don't just have observables, but you also have subjects. And subjects, as I mentioned, are observables. The key difference in the end just is that with subjects, you also take care of emitting those values manually. So there you don't just subscribe, but you also emit the values. Whereas with observables, you typically have some data source, like an interval, that emits values automatically, or that produces values automatically. That's one important difference. But in the end, subjects are special kinds of observables, therefore, because you still subscribe to them and you still can subscribe to one and the same subject in different places, in different components, for example, if you need to. Now, you might also recall, though, that at least in modern Angular versions, you also have a built-in concept called signals, which, unlike observables, is not coming from a third-party library like the observable related functions are, but which instead are built into Angular. And therefore, I now want to use a signal and then explore the differences and similarities, and also how you can convert a signal to an observable and vice versa. So I got my interval observable here. Now to use a signal, I want to hook up this button here. So my idea is to add a method in this app component. I'll name it onClick. The name is up to you though. And this method should be triggered when the button is clicked, and therefore I'll add this click event binding and trigger this onClick method I just added. And with that, I then want to create a signal here, and I'll name it click count, and create it with the signal function that's provided by Angular and that's therefore imported from Angular core. And I'll give this signal an initial value of 0. Now, of course, in onClick, we can use this click count and update or set that signal value, for example, by calling the update function. And we'll get the previous count here as an input to this function that we have to pass to update, and we can then return the new value that should be set to that signal. So for example, pref count plus 1 to update that click count. Well, and then we can of course also output that value, for example here in the template. Click count like this, as you learned it before in this course. In addition, we can of course also go to our component function here and also, for example, set up an effect with help of the constructor function by calling the effect function, which is also imported from @Angular core. And to that function, we then pass a function which will automatically be re-executed by Angular whenever any signal you use in here updates. So here we could console log clicked button, and then I want to output the number of times I clicked it. So I'll convert this to a template literal by using backticks so that I can inject the click count like this into this string. This click count to be precise. And I'll then say times thereafter, so that we output clicked button X times. In addition, to make sure that we don't have too much console output, I'll actually clean up or comment out this interval observable so that we're not getting any log messages from there. With that, if I reload, I initially see clicked button 0 times. But if I then click this button, the number here in the template updates, and of course, this output here also updates, or we're seeing new outputs to be precise. So that's working as expected. And of course, if you now take a closer look at this, this also looks like a stream of data, especially like a stream of data that could have been produced with help of a subject, since we're essentially emitting new values by calling update ourselves. So what's the difference compared to an observable then, and where are maybe also some similarities?